Hey everybody, I'm Tami Kiekhaefer. I'm a licensed clinical social worker.
My name is Desiree Grimaldi. Welcome to Unguarded Minds podcast, where we talk about all the gritty things that life throws at us and the dramas and traumas. Today we have a special guest, Jason Tuttle. He is the creator of Letters to Zachary, and he is going to talk to us about grief and how to get maybe men to open up a little bit more about their grief, and hope that our audience can relate and he could provide some insight. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate y'all having me on.
Absolutely. So your story is one that too many probably experience in life, and that's the loss of a child. We're going to kind of let you guide the conversation as it is your story, and we don't want to pry or touch on things. I know you said you're open to anything, but if you just want to give us a little bit of history and then what that has turned into for others.
Okay, so as of this year, I've been married 21 years to my wife. We decided pretty shortly after we got married that we wanted to have kids. I being mainly from the South, my wife living up from the Northeast, being a cradle Catholic, and we got to talking one day, and she goes, I'd like to have 4 kids. And as a man, initially I went, let's have the first one and then we'll talk. Now, granted, I always thought I was going to have kind of the nuclear family, the husband and wife and the 3 kids, that kind of thing. So having one additional at that point wasn't the biggest deal. It had never been presented to me that way. And so about a year after we got married, she got pregnant. It was actually her hairstylist that recognized it before anybody else did. She was getting her hair done. She goes, you look a little green. Are you pregnant? And she went to go take a test, and boom, she was pregnant. So, she got pregnant. We went through kind of the normal routine of it. We had no real issues at that point, nothing of any concern. And I remember one of the days before we got kind of to the week 20 appointment, my wife looks at me and goes, well, what if we have a child with medical needs? And my response was, well, if we do, then we're just going to have them. I'm not a big proponent or fan of some of the methods not to. And so I just said, we'll just have them. We'll deal with what comes our way. And so everything was going fine. We got to the week 20 appointment, and my wife being from New England and that kind of lifestyle and all that, she didn't want to know the sex of the child. She was of the idea that, well, this is the last great mystery that we have. I don't want to know till our child is born. I did, simply because I was the one making the nursery, and I didn't want to paint neutral colors, and I that was more or less why I wanted to know. So we get to the week 20 appointment, which is that one where you find out the sex of the child, and we get into the ultrasound, and the tech is doing her thing, and we playfully go back and forth, and she gets to that point. She goes, well, I need to know the sex of the child. Would y'all like to know? And we're playing back and forth. And before we can make an answer, she goes, well, I really need to know. I've found an issue. And so at that point we went, well, we'd like to know the sex of the child. She said, you're having a boy. And after she said that, we said, well, can you tell us what the issue is? And she said, well, no, that's more kind of a doctor thing. I said, well, why did you need to know the sex? She said, well, if it's what I think it is, it's rare in boys. It's even rarer in girls. And I went, well, okay, then. And so from that point forward, we started seeing a perinatologist, which, for those that don't know, it's essentially just a high-risk OBGYN. They kind of look out for bigger issues than what your typical OBGYN does. So we saw them for several weeks, and through those weeks, they gave us every terrible scenario you can think of for the next probably 16 weeks. We've learned in this long journey that you run across 2 kinds of doctors. Either you run across one that doesn't want to tell you anything for fear if they say something wrong, you're going to sue them, or you find the other kind of doctor that wants to tell you everything under the sun as if to cover himself so you won't sue them. And I've told many doctors over the years, I said, y'all don't know everything about medical science. If if you're a little off, I'm not litigious. I get that there's some play there. So we get to the point that my wife's going to have the child. He gets born. We have a C-section. She gave birth. They came down to the head end of my wife. She saw him for about 30 seconds, and then they took him up to the NICU at the hospital we were at. She had to recover and all that. So I went up to the NICU, and it was at that point that the doctor goes, well, your son was born with a rare condition called Eagle-Barrett syndrome. And I went, what? And he goes, he'll be here tonight. He's going to get whisked off to the Children's Hospital on the north side of Atlanta. And he'll be there till they deem he's okay to come home. And so, up to this point, we had no idea. In fact, we had gone through some genealogy before then, and my father had gone through like 10 generations of my family, and there was nothing. My wife's family went through 5 generations of their family. There was nothing. And we, which I'll get to a little later, within 2 years had 2 kids with multiple special needs, almost identical to each other. So getting to my son, the next, when they do C-section, typically these days they'll give about 3 days in the hospital, and then they kind of push you out the door. Well, my wife, because she wanted to be up there with her son, I got out of the hospital in 2 days, and I still give her a ton of credit for that, just for the type of surgery it was to have to be able to get up and move in 48 hours from that happening. So we finally get up to the hospital, and we're in the NICU up at the Children's Hospital, and they hit us with every sort of thing that they think's going on. But to give a little bit of an explanation without getting too technical in it, Eagle-Barrett syndrome is a rare condition because it's 1 in 40,000 births. They know it's affiliated with a kidney issue. My son was born with 1 kidney that sustained some damage in utero, but they don't know the official cause of it. They don't know what starts all of it. They know it's related to the kidneys. So he only had 1 kidney that was sustaining some damage in utero. Basically what it was doing is the kidney's a filter. It wasn't filtering properly, and it was backing up into his kidney. The other issue related to Eagle-Barrett syndrome is the fact they have an abnormally large bladder, that at least for the first 5 years of my son's life, he had to be given a catheter every 4 hours to drain his bladder. Otherwise, he was susceptible to urinary tract infections and several other things. The main issue with Eagle-Barrett syndrome is they are born without any abdominal muscles, like your main like 6-pack that everybody wants, your obliques, the sides, none of it. Like I could lay him on the floor, and the only thing between the outside world and his organs was the skin and the little bit of fascia that holds it together, and that was it. Like I could lay him on the floor, and I could literally with my finger point to his large intestine, his small intestine, his kidney, his all those organs down below, like you looking at a biology class like plastic dummy. I could literally touch all of that. And the other thing related to Eagle-Barrett syndrome was he had a normal lung capacity, but because like you and I we have core abdominal muscles, so when we get sick, we've got kind of that almost foundation that we can press against to create pressure to like cough things out when we get a pneumonia style illness. He didn't have that. So what would happen would be is once I heard a specific cough, I would then have to go through my medical protocol and try to get it out of his system. If I didn't, it would sit there and compound, and he would ultimately be admitted to the hospital into one of the ICUs every time it happened. So for about the first 6 years of his life, we literally were in and out of the ICU every 6 months because that's just how quickly it would happen. So from the kidney all the way to the lungs, that's Eagle-Barrett syndrome. That doesn't include any of the other medical issues. It's of no relation to the other 4 things that he was born with. So that's kind of how life started off with my wife and I as it relates to our family. And this was before our daughter, before we found out she had any issues.
So your firstborn, that was Zachary?
That was Zachary, correct.
Did I mean, I'm sure you guys went through so much, but like the thought of even having another kid after going through that the first time, was that kind of like a little bit of a battle for you guys, or did you just trust in your faith and know that you still wanted to have more kids and you weren't going to kind of let that hold you back? Or
We always knew we were going to have more than one. Now, as you can imagine, we faced a good bit of backlash from family because their comment was, well, you've got all these issues, especially a rare condition, and you're wanting to have another one. What happens if that child has medical issues? I'm a researcher, so once we were out of the hospital and we were kind of on a routine, and I was doing the things that was kind of trying to keep them out of the hospital. I asked around. I was just like, is there any possibility that, say, if I have another child, that they're going to get this rare condition? There was no concrete evidence that they would even remotely get the Eagle-Barrett syndrome that my son had. Is there any belief that all the other issues that he had, would another child get that? No, there's no anything with that. So as far as we knew people that had kids with medical disabilities, and they went on to have 2 or 3 more kids, and there were no issues whatsoever. So our thought was we wanted him to have a sibling. And when we did have our daughter, before we found out about her issues, at that point, we were going to, even though my wife initially said 4, we were going to stop at that point, just because we're just like, we got a lot going on with our son. And then we're glad that we did, because then when we found out about the issues with her, we were just like, I don't have the energy, the brain power, whatever you want to call it, to be able to deal with more than 2. So yeah, we were pretty set on having another one.
With everything that happened just so fast, and and the delivery and the C-section and Zachary being swept away, it sounds like you automatically had to go into task mode and action mode. When did the emotional side kick in, and how did you manage that between you and your wife and family?
Well, as me as a man, and probably a lot of men, I learned very quickly, especially with this special needs life, to compartmentalize. It was one of those things where I would go, excuse me, where I would go, I'll deal with this other stuff in a minute, but I need to focus on this, because I need to figure out what their care is, what I need to do, how I need to do it, who I need to talk to, all those different things. So my son had been up in the NICU up at the Children's Hospital, and about the 3rd day I was up there, I'll never forget it. I went up in there, I went to go visit him, and I was sitting on the end of the crib, and I was just kind of sitting, just kind of looking at him, as he was sleeping. And the head nurse came over to me, and I can remember her coming in on my left side and saying all these just different medical things. And it just felt like the weight was getting heavier and heavier, and just out of the blue, it just hits me like a ton of bricks. I lose it at this point, because I'm just like, I'm just married. This is my first child. I have no idea of any of these issues. I never thought that, I'd have to know so much medical so fast. And I just started, for lack of better words, blubbering like an idiot. And, I regained composure, and, my parents took me down to lunch in the cafeteria, and then right in the middle of lunch, I lost it again, just because just the weight of the world was just kind of on me. And part of it was, the stereotype where the man's got to be strong. We've got to be able to figure things out. And it was there was a lot of it that was kind of like, how am I going to figure this out? What am I going to do? How am I going to make this seem to his mother that it's maybe not as serious as what it actually is? So it was about that 3rd day after he was born where it just kind of hit me.
Which makes sense, I guess, with that grief cycle, the shock is first, and that's about 3 to 5 days that you're just in total shock of what? This can't be real. This must be a dream. This, and then that reality hits you, and it just takes you down. So did your family, sorry, with your family, I think you had said when you thought about having another child, you got some backlash with Zachary and this whole situation. Did you feel like your family really stepped up and was there for you, or was there like, here's what you need to do, or if we were in your shoes, here's, just a lot of opinions sometimes come in because people try to fix it instead of just be there for you. What was your experience?
My parents were great about it. They were very understanding. They got to a point, especially when he was really young, that like every Sunday, they would take him for the day to watch him, to take care of him. And they, like me, learned real quick what they needed to kind of look out for. They needed to do should something happen. I always had my phone on me just in case if my wife and I were kind of having a date day at that point, that, if they called, I could come running, that kind of thing. So they from the start were very helpful, and that they didn't know exactly what the challenge was, but they knew it was a difficult challenge. They knew it was kind of something unprecedented. And so just by them watching my son for a couple of hours on a Sunday made all the difference in the world. My wife's parents, they were loving to our son and my daughter subsequently, but they were standoffish in the sense of they didn't really know how to react to it. Don't get me wrong, they weren't mean or upset or ugly to him by any stretch of the imagination. This was foreign to them. All of the kids in their entire family, and being a New England Catholic family, there was a lot of them. There was no issues, none whatsoever. And so to have all of a sudden being thrust into this, it was more, I think it was more, they didn't know how to comprehend it.
Yeah. I think that's so in our culture, which is, what you're getting into, is we don't talk about death and dying and the grief that goes along with it. It's and people, it's an uncomfortable subject for a lot of people in our culture. So it even puts it in that much more of a compartment that people can feel pretty isolated. And you're right, people don't know what to say, because the one thing that they could say is, let me fix it, let me bring them back, or let me change the situation, which is impossible. So that's where you get a lot of comments from people that can sort of blow you away and damage relationships sometimes. But so what were your next steps after Zachary was in the ICU? And
at that point, at one point we had 6 specialists that we had to see every 6 months. We eventually whittled them down to 4, and that was pulmonology, urology, neurology, and there was another one that I'm forgetting, but I know there was another one that we had to start seeing every 6 months at that point, just because the Eagle-Barrett syndrome was, intricate on his own, and we started learning about all of his pulmonary issues related to that. So I had to start kind of going to a pulmonologist, kind of see, well, how can we have a proactive step to this, and how can we get ahead of it? We know he'll probably end up in the hospital, but try to keep him as minimal as possible. And it was that, and for the first 5 years, even with his daughter being born 2 years after him, there was a lot of trial and error, because for about the first 5 years, I hadn't really seen everything that he was dealing with. And once I began to see all the issues he was dealing with, after about that 5th year, it almost got like old hat, because I dealt with it enough to where when it happened, it didn't really surprise me. So that was kind of what the routine was, at least for about the first 5 years, was what's going on, who do we need to talk to, how do we get diagnoses, and once we get those diagnoses, where do we go from there?
So how old was Zachary when you had your daughter?
He was 2 or almost 2.
Okay. And what is your little girl's name?
Samantha.
Samantha. Okay. Did you want to talk about some of the conditions that she was born with?
Sure. My son and daughter were born with the exact same conditions except for the Eagle-Barrett syndrome. That was just my son. Now, the rest of the conditions that both of my children had were severe neurological delays, meaning my son, when he passed away, was 15 years old, but he functioned about 4 to 6 years old his entire life. My daughter, who's 16 or will be 16 this year, functions about 4 to 6 years old. Both of them were born with epilepsy. They both had seizures. In fact, of the 6 different kinds of seizures, I've seen 4 of them in my house alone. Both of them were nonverbal. Now, they had a couple of simple words that they would say, but to like hold a conversation, no, they were not even nowhere close to that. Although I could ask them yes/no questions and they would go, to say yes to it, or like clap their hands, that kind of thing. But to do anything more than that, no. They both walked with assistance, meaning like me holding them behind them and walking with them, but to walk on their own, no. They were both basically wheelchair bound. Now, granted, you could put them on the floor and they could army crawl as fast as anything to go anywhere, but to like stand up and walk, no. My daughter, even to this day, I can walk with her, but she can't do it by herself. And so from the neurological all the way to the wheelchair bound was all the other issues that they were dealing with that were all separate entities unto themselves that had no relation to any of them.
Were you just living in crisis mode?
It may have been crisis mode. I always called it go mode. Because there were several times in the middle, like my son had a baby monitor in his room all of his life. Mm-hmm. And so I would have it next to me. And if any of the sounds that I heard that just resonated with me, like his cough or something that made me think something's not right, I would bolt out of bed and come over here to his room across the house. And so there were many times in the middle of the night, I literally had to get up, get dressed, get my son, put him in his wheelchair, and drive like a madman to the north side of Atlanta to take him to the Children's Hospital, to the ER. So even from the day he was born, I don't think I've had a decent night's sleep in 20 years. I don't sleep well. And a lot of that stems from just all those years of sleeping very lightly and listening for things and that kind of thing.
Do you have the same setup for your daughter right now? Like, does she have the monitor and all that?
She does. We have that set up for her. They both have what they call sleep safe beds. They're basically fancy hospital beds, but they look a little more like home style beds, and they've got the higher up like sides to them. Because like with my daughter, I was having issues with her not realizing she was on the side of the bed and wanting to roll off. Yeah. And so we got these beds to where I could put the sides up and lock it, but like the top was completely open to lock it. So if she did roll into the side, she wouldn't necessarily roll off the bed. Mm. So we have that, but even though my daughter has all of the same similar issues, it was my son that was by far more medically fragile.
Now, going to all the doctors and stuff, were any of them telling you like what the future was going to look like for you? Or like, is that something? Because I don't know. I feel like doctors, like you said, they kind of just throw everything at you. Mm-hmm. Every worst case scenario. When I was pregnant, I refused to get any of those tests. I was like, you are not destroying the last 8 months of my pregnancy. Yeah. But were they telling you like life expectancy or like all of the things that?
I essentially knew for both my son and daughter that they would always need some form of care. And in the beginning, for those that are special needs parents, when you start getting delayed, there's still hope there, because even though there's a small delay, there's enough time to overcome it. But the farther along you get and the bigger the delay gets from what their age is versus what their functioning age is, like my daughter, if she's truly functioning at 4 to 6 years old and she's 16, that's 10 years worth of time. And even though my wife may be a little more optimistic, and I'm optimistic, but I'm also realistic, and I'm just like, there's no way she's going to cover that much ground with the fact that she still has neurological delays. So what my job is at this point is to make the best quality of life for her with the ability that she has. As for the doctors, they said something about always needing care, but I didn't really get much more than that. I honestly after a certain amount of time, I just kind of started assuming that. Early on, I was just like, well, if she's not going to function like a normal adult, it's now my job to make quality of life as best as it can be while I'm taking care of her.
It's what you have control over.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How did Letters to Zachary begin? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So approximately 2.5 years ago, my son suddenly and unexpectedly passed away. It was on this death certificate, it was related to an issue of my son's special needs. Although, even though it's not the official issue, excuse me, from the signs that I saw that morning before I took him to the hospital and what I heard, because I was in the ER room when they were working on him. I was there from the moment that they worked on him to the moment that they pronounced him. So I watched and saw the entire thing right in front of my face. And based on everything that I saw and all the wording that I heard, because I'm one of those people that I'll pick up on weird things and just store them. And so I went later and got the ER notes and I read through it thoroughly. And based on what they had said and their procedures, even though they related it to one of his medical special needs, I 100% believe that he somehow got gastroenteritis and it got too far. And if you go on any of the medical websites, all of them say, if you see any of the signs, all of which my son had, take him to the ER immediately or call an ambulance. And so the issue was I wasn't prone to look for those issues, so I never looked for them. And by the time I finally saw them, it was well beyond when it should have been. And even the ER doc, after she had pronounced him, said, you could have been up here 2 hours before when you were, or earlier this morning, and the outcome would have probably been the same. Because ultimately what had kind of happened was it caused an infection somewhere in one of his intestines. It got into his bloodstream. It caused sepsis. And even the ER doc said, even in the hospital, if we don't catch it right from the start, she said, the fatality rate is something ridiculous. It's like 94, 95%. It's something very high once it gets in the bloodstream. And that's what we believe happened. He got an infection. It got into his bloodstream. And when it did that, it got into his heart. It started affecting his heart. And it just quickly went downhill from there. Is kind of what happened. So my son had passed. We went through that whole process. We went through the funeral process. We had him cremated, that kind of thing. And we finally kind of got back to the house after kind of, typically when someone passes away, you got about a week or two where you got everybody and their brother coming in and offering condolences and meals and all that. We were very thankful and fortunate for that. But after about that 2 weeks, it was kind of one of those, the old quote, the silence is deafening. We started experiencing that. So I'm a big proponent of counseling, and I was seeing a counselor at the time, and it was her comment, probably about the 5th or 6th time I'd see him after my son had passed. She goes, have you ever thought about journaling? And the ironic thing that I said to her was, I don't know if that's my thing. I don't know how great of a writer I am. And she goes, well, she said, you don't necessarily have to do it now. But she said, even if you write it and say, throw it in the fire and burn it, you can at least get it out. And it can be kind of cathartic for you. And so I said, okay. And so that idea it literally sat, I literally wrote it out about journaling, and it sat on my side table for probably 8 months. I didn't think anything about it. I was just like, I don't know if I really want to do it. And one day I was having a really tough time. I was having an emotional moment. I just opened a Word document, and in letter form, I wrote the date, Dear Zachary, and I just wrote. And so, and I'm one of those people, I don't pull any punches. I'll write raw and unfiltered. And so
Cathartic.
if I felt like I needed to write an expletive laden letter, that's what I was going to write. If I needed to drop F-bombs because that's just the feeling in the moment, that's what I was going to write. So I wrote this long, like page and a half, 2-page letter of just how I was feeling and what was going on, all that kind of stuff. And I did that for several weeks. And then finally, I was a part of a grief group that was actually specifically for parents that had lost a special needs child, which was a small group. And I was honestly surprised I found it. And I got in there one day and got to know the admin really well. And I said, do you mind if I post one of my journal entries? She said, no, go for it. We get so few men in here. I'd love to read what at least to get an idea of what you're feeling. And so I did. And almost immediately I got a huge response. I had a lot of people say, we love your writing. This is so clear and concise, and we like how you're taking very difficult concepts and making simple analogies for it so that people can understand it. And I mean, I've never been one to toot my own horn, so to speak, but I had one wife and mother that said, I have never, ever told anybody exactly how I felt on the inside, and you have nailed it word for word in this letter. And I said, well, I appreciate it. I said, it's inspired by my son. I said, I give him all the credit because it's just kind of how I'm feeling. And so that was kind of the response I got. So for several weeks after that, I continued posting on there, and I was constantly getting the same response. And throughout this time, I got people, well, have you ever thought about doing a podcast? No, I don't know if I have the brain space for that at this point. And then someone said, well, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I went, honestly, I don't think I have enough material at this point. Now, granted, I've got a 2-inch binder full of stuff, so I could at least submit something. And so I said, I don't know if I have enough material. And then someone finally said, well, have you ever thought about just doing a Facebook page? I said, well, I could copy and paste, sure. And so I started doing that. And, I initially started off with kind of a few followers, like everybody that does it. And one day out of the blue, I got this idea. I said, I'm going to start emailing a lot of what I would consider the big names in the grief community, and just to ask them pointers. And so I started finding all of them. I said, hey, my name is so-and-so. I'm starting this page. I'd like to grow it. Can you give me some pointers on what direction I need to go? And all of them, I was kind of shocked. All of them said, sure, if you're going to write a book, you may want to create a website. You may want to do A, B, and C. If you're going to go this direction, you might want to do D, E, F, that kind of thing. And so I did that. And so from that point forward, it just started growing and growing. And it just seemed like every month I was getting at least 100 followers a month, that kind of thing, which for a large page, it doesn't seem like a lot. But for me, I was ecstatic because I was just like, I'm getting 100 people a month that I don't know that are following this page that like this material. And so it just kept building and building. And then the first podcast I ever happened to run across, I got on her podcast and I did it, and she was connected with like 4,000 or 5,000 people. And she really liked my story, and she just started sharing the page and my story with people, and the page started growing even more. And so I had a lot of people that kind of helped out where the following really started. Outside of the content had to be there, but I started getting a bigger and bigger following. Well, as of today, 9 months since I started, I'm over 1,000 followers. I have representation in 44 of the 50 U.S. states, and I'm in 24 countries at this point in just 9 months. And I'm still building and trying to grow it even more. Like my goal is to get like some of those pages you see online that are 10,000, 20,000, that kind of thing is what I'm trying to do. And so initially the page was specifically for men just because I want men to have a safe space, so to speak, that they could open up. But since then, I've opened it up to anybody that's lost a loved one, spouses, wives, you name it. And so that's grown it even more. And that's kind of where I'm at this point.
Are you on TikTok or anything?
I am, and I never thought at my 47 years of age I'd be on TikTok. Honestly, I was never going to get on there, but on TikTok, there's a gentleman by the name of Lenny Hunt. He's a grief coach. He's got 250,000 followers, and I found him, and I actually know him personally now. I've actually collaborated with him. And I initially saw his videos and him doing everything on there. And he one day said to me, he said, you may not know, but there's a huge grief community on TikTok. He says, one of the reasons why over the last 10 years I've been able to build 250,000 plus followers on here. And I said, really? And so I got on there, and in the beginning I was posting pretty much still frame memes where I was making a picture and I was putting some of my writing in it, doing that. Just one day out of the blue, I was just like, I'll make a video. And from that day forward, I've been making short, typically 5-minute or less videos, just because I know most people aren't going to watch longer than about 5 minutes, especially on TikTok. And I typically will get about 500 or 600 views of most of my videos. I'm nothing grand at this point, although like Facebook, I'd like to get it there, but I'm slowly building a following on there as well. But yeah, I'm on TikTok, although like I said, I just never thought at my age I'd be on TikTok.
Do you tell them though on TikTok, like, to go find you on Facebook and kind of direct it back to your group?
I do. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and I all intertwine those pages. I will typically tell people that Facebook is my main page, TikTok is my secondary page, and then it's not that I don't do Twitter and Instagram as much. Typically, a lot of the content that I do on those two pages, I'll transfer over to Twitter and Instagram, just so instead of doing 4 original things a day, I'm doing 2 original things a day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you need any assistance, with your back office type stuff, Desiree is your person.
Gotcha. Well, thank you.
She is amazing with that SEO stuff, whatever your magic is that she does behind the scenes. Like, she's your girl.
Also, there's somebody that might be good to connect with. I know her personally, but she has, I guess it's public, so it's not that bad. But her daughter was murdered or killed. And then her granddaughter, she was 2 or 3. She just recently passed, but she has a podcast called Release of Grief. Her name is Faith. And so she does a lot in that space too. I could definitely intro you guys after, but I think that you guys could do some sort of collaboration if you.
Funny you should say that. I have done her podcast.
Oh.
Yeah. It's interesting in this community because once you do one, you start learning everybody, and it's like everybody does everybody's. And so yeah, she was one of probably the about 4th or 5th one I ever did. So yeah, I really enjoyed doing her podcast.
She is one of the strongest women I know. I mean, she has been through some stuff. But yeah, she's in that space. I know that she's doing a lot there. How is your wife handling everything? Like, I know we talked a lot about like your journey through it, and I don't want to take any, like, but a mother, like, I don't know, that's got to be a completely different grief, I would think.
Well, our marriage relationship has never been traditional. She's typically kind of quiet and unto herself. She grieves in her own way. At least at the house, I'm a little outwardly emotional. I'm not that way out in public by any stretch of the imagination. But, she's reserved. She kind of keeps it unto herself. She'll tell me all the time that, I miss Zachary. I miss his laugh. I miss his giving him a hug, that kind of thing. But that kind of goes along with kind of how her family is. And based on what I know of her upbringing and how they all kind of were, in fact, recently we've had kind of a lot of passings in her family, a lot of the older generation in her family, and they'll grieve and mourn for 2 or 3 days, and they move on, and they don't necessarily understand our stance of kind of continually being in grief. Now, are we outwardly emotional every day? At this point, no. But they don't grasp the concept that, at any point in time, it could just hit us and we're going to have a rough day. And that may be because, it was, I don't want to make light of it, but they lost a cousin or someone kind of outside the inner circle, whereas we lost a child. And I mean, honestly, I don't want to rank them, but there is a difference there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of thing. So, I mean, I'll never forget the day that I took my son up and he passed away. We were all under the assumption that he was going to go up there. They were going to diagnose him with something. We were going to get admitted. He'd be there for about a week. We'd come home. When I called her literally moments after they had pronounced him, I will never forget the sound she made. Just utter devastation and heartbreak on the other end of that phone. It is burned into my memory. That's the one and only time I've ever seen her that emotional. And I mean, it's understandable, but I'll never forget it. So outside of those moments and things, and like at the viewing, that stuff, she's generally pretty reserved, pretty quiet, whereas I'm a little more outwardly.
Did your daughter have the capacity to understand what had happened, and like how was that on her?
Well, the morning that I took him up, she went to school. And she always knew, because whenever he was in the hospital, I was the one that took him. I stayed with him the whole time, and I brought him home. So she went to school. Everything happened. My wife and I drove home without him. She came home from school. And even though she couldn't talk or maybe even understand to the fullest extent, you could tell that she knew something was up, almost as if she had this look of, well, you're home. Zachary's not home. Why is Zachary not home? And, I, from that day forward, for the longest time, just said, girl, if Daddy could have brought Zachary home, I would have done anything to bring him home. I would have done everything in my power to bring him home. And so for the longest time, I felt like her behavior towards me was she hated me for it. And again, I there's no offense taken on my end. That was just how she expressed it. And, she would just out of the blue kind of have meltdowns that were uncharacteristic. And we just took that as she was having a moment, missing her brother, that kind of thing. That was probably the best that she could understand it. However, since then, she used to call her brother Bubba because that was the word that would come out. And ever since he passed, I've noticed that she says Bubba a heck of a lot more. And we are a family of religious faith and all. And there have been multiple times that we've been doing like eating dinner at the dinner table. And she is literally dead stopped in her tracks, turned her head and looked up at a diagonal up towards the light, and she would literally focus on it. Like I could not get her attention. And when she'd finally snap out of it, I would go, "Was Bubba here?" And she would immediately go, "Hmm. And I said, "Is Bubba watching over us?" And she'd immediately respond. I said, "Bubba happy?" And she would respond almost immediately. And she did, like today, if I ask her something, if she doesn't want to respond, she won't respond. And so I'm a firm believer that loved ones could come back and visit. As crazy as some people may think that sounds, I'm a firm believer in signs. And so there have been multiple occasions since he's passed away where she just out of the blue done that. And I'm just like, "Is Bubba here?" And so I think that's his way of watching over his sister. Because when they used to ride the same special needs lift bus, when they would pull up and I could see them sitting in their positions, her brother was eyeing her like a hawk. Like he always watched over her. Like he was always making sure that everything was okay. So that was kind of the evolution of, in my opinion, how she's dealt with it since he's passed.
Yeah, that's just fascinating that there's got to be a connection. I mean, they are brother and sister. They got each other in their own way that they could, but just a connection was obviously, a bond was obviously there. So you just do wonder, how do people grieve that might not be able to capture the full story or be able to verbalize what's going on? And I think you just painted a perfect picture of that. Well, this has been. Oh, go ahead, Des.
Sorry. No, I was going to say, I know that we just touched on like Facebook and TikTok and Instagram and all of that. What is the name of your Facebook group?
It's Letters to Zachary.
Okay. And that's the same on Instagram and TikTok?
Well, it is, but there's a slight variation. On Facebook, it's Letters to the word TO. On Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, it's Letters the number 2 Zachary.
Okay.
And it's only that way just because I couldn't get it that way from Facebook to everywhere else.
Gotcha. All right.
Well, we really appreciate you giving space to offer to people who are grieving and don't quite know where to start or just need some validation, and even your journal entries helping people find some words that they just can't come up with themselves. And I'm sure, I have no doubt, you're doing some amazing things out there.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. We appreciate you being on here today, and we'll connect all your links here, and we hope to stay in touch.
Certainly. Thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.